All right, well, here we go. Welcome. I am Colleen Young, a PhD in biological anthropology with a focus on the causes and products of body size and shape evolution on islands. I am here for Iconema Talks with renowned evolutionary biologist and philosopher, Dr. Massimo Pigliucci. Dr. Pigliucci is currently the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at City College and Professor of Philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He originally received his PhD in biology and made important contributions to the extended evolutionary synthesis on topics relating to plasticity, development, and evolvability. He was elected a Fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, not only for his work in, but his defense of evolutionary biology from pseudoscience attacks. He then received a PhD in philosophy and has written extensively on Stoicism in recent years. Outside of the academy, he dedicates his time to public outreach with magazines, podcasts, and societies. We are truly excited to meet with Dr. Pigliucci today to discuss his journey, his science, and the place of Stoicism in today's society. I currently have one of my staples of my dissertation right here, Coffee Stains and Wine.
Yeah, I recognize that book.
Yeah, this was a backbone of my dissertation, so I'm very fortunate to meet you and talk with you today. Okay, so the first question, beyond the academic introduction that I had just made, who is Massimo Pigliucci in words, towards a more private, familiar environment? What has your story been like, and the general context through which you came to be who you are now?
Oh, that's a good question. It's difficult to answer, actually. I grew up in Italy. And I started pursuing an academic career early on. Actually, family lore says that I declared that I wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid, when I was like 5 or 6 years old. Although my initial interest was not biology, it was astronomy of all things. And then eventually I discovered biology in high school, and I pursued the standard academic career, undergraduate, doctorate, etc. And at some point, I decided that I needed to move abroad to sort of improve my understanding of things, make contact with people outside of my, more or less narrow environment up to that point. And so that's why I decided to move to the United States. And I was about 26 when I did that. And I kept pursuing my academic career here in the States. Eventually, I did a postdoc at Brown, and then I became a professor at University of Tennessee, Stony Brook, and now CUNY. Now, in the meantime, of course, all sorts of other things happen, just like life normally is the case. So got married, got divorced, got married again, had a daughter who is now 24 and beginning her own career as a journalist, working for CNN. So it's all sorts of interesting things. Had some interesting life experiences. Like, for instance, I would have never imagined that I would have lived 9 years in Tennessee, which is in the middle of the Bible Belt in the south of the United States, as an evolutionary biologist. And so I was in the middle of discussions about evolution versus creationism, and that changed my way of looking at things, because it never occurred to me, actually, growing up in Italy, that people in the 20th century and now 21st century would still take things like notions like creationism seriously, but they do. And, it's a large number of people, at least in that area of the country. So that brought me to develop an interest in pseudoscience and anti-scientific notions, which has then stayed with me. I've published a couple of books on that topic, one of which was Nonsense and Stills, and it's about the notion of pseudoscience and how we can tell the difference between science and pseudoscience, that sort of stuff. So, and then a few years ago, I was going through a more or less standard midlife crisis, and a few things happening. As again, things do happen in life, including, for instance, my father getting sick and dying. And then I realized that I needed some kind of framework to deal with life setbacks, and that I did not have it, because I grew up Catholic, But I left the church when I was about 15, maybe. And then after that, I always considered myself a secular humanist. But when life started providing me with some interesting challenges and some setbacks, I found that secular humanism was not particularly helpful from a practical perspective. I have no idea how to deal with these issues. For instance, the grief about my father dying. And that's when I discovered Stoicism. I did some research. I said, well, in the meantime, I had actually shifted from biology to philosophy. And I said, well, you're a philosopher now. Figure it out. Surely there are resources out there in philosophy that would help you with these kind of things. And sure enough, I investigated a number of possible philosophies of life, including Buddhism, for instance, and Aristotle and Epicurus. And then I landed on Stoicism, and that has made a major difference in my life and eventually in the life of other people, because I started writing about Stoicism, and this has had a positive impact on other people's lives, which is very rewarding. And so here we are now.
That's quite the journey. What I think is really fascinating, there's kind of a thread between your evolutionary biology work and your philosophy work in terms of the way you view evolutionary processes and that development, and how animals sometimes deal with the challenges in life can in turn affect later on the types of animals that are evolving, or the shapes and forms, etc. How do you think evolutionary biology fed into your attraction to Stoicism and vice versa? Do they feed off each other?
Yeah, they do. And it's an interesting question. That one of the things that attracted me to the Stoics, as opposed to other philosophies of life, is that the Stoics were very mindful of what we would today call science. They refer to it as physics, from the Greek word physis, which just means nature. And they thought that the study of nature, understanding nature, is fundamental in order to decide what kind of life you want to live. And the reason they thought so is because they took seriously the notion that the question of what makes a human being happy hinges on what kind of animal a human being actually is. So just to give you a trivial, perhaps, analogy, if somebody comes to your home and gives you a present of, let's say, a cactus plant, right? Well, now you have to ask yourself, what makes a cactus happy? Because if you want that cactus to thrive and to do well, and so you have to realize that it requires a lot of light but little water. If you make the mistake of giving it too much water, you're gonna kill it. So just in the same way in which there is such a thing as a good life for a cactus or for any other plant or any other animal, there is also such a thing as a good life and a bad life for human beings, according to the Stoics. And in order to figure it out, you have to study nature. You have to study, in particular, human nature, but also in general how things work in the world. If you don't understand how the world works, then you're likely to make mistakes about your decisions in life. And that will therefore get in the way of your flourishing and your happiness. So very much Stoicism is the kind of philosophy that takes into account good reasoning. The Stoics were very good at logic, for instance, and science. And so to me, as a scientist and a philosopher, somebody who's interested in both empirical evidence and good reasoning about the world, then Stoicism was a natural fit.
It's interesting. Okay. So how did you imagine your life as an adult when you were a child? You mentioned there was some lore in your family about you wanting to be a scientist when you're a young one. Do you remember this? Did you see yourself as someone linked to science and evolutionary biology and philosophy when you were young? Or when did all this appear? Was there like an introduction, a mentor? How did it happen?
Yeah, good question. I did imagine myself as a scientist since I was very little. And I remember reading books by Carl Sagan, for instance, the astronomer, and by others that were about not only science popularizing, but also life as a scientist, what it would be like to be a scientist as a profession. And of course, I couldn't imagine any of the details because I had I was not exposed to any experience yet of actually being a scientist, but I did imagine myself pursuing something along the lines of a career like Carl Sagan or Peter Medawar, for instance, who was a cancer biologist, as it turns out, who wrote this wonderful little book that I read when I was a kid, which was, How to Be a Scientist, or Advice to a Young Scientist, I think it was the title. In terms of mentorship, I grew up with my grandfather, and my adoptive grandfather, as it turns out. We were not related by DNA. And he was a wonderful person for a number of reasons, but more importantly, I guess, in terms of impact on my life, he understood very early on that my interest in science was not transitory. It was an important thing for me. It was an important part of my life already as a kid. And so he encouraged it. He started bringing me to one of the largest bookstores in Rome on a regular basis, and I would have the pick of whatever book I wanted. And usually I went to the science section and pick something from there. He's the one that gave me my first little telescope, for instance, when I was a kid, that sort of. So it was very encouraging. It was not only not belittling or not taking it seriously, but it was actually very encouraging. He himself was not particularly well educated. I think he had a high school diploma, basically, but he understood the importance of education, of encouraging me in that regard. So, in terms of mentorship, he was the one that encouraged me. But of course, my actual mentors were indirect mentorships, right? Again, people like Carl Sagan and Peter Medawar and those people, and later on Stephen Jay Gould, for instance. Those were the people the authors that I read and that made a huge impact when I was a teenager, first in high school and then eventually in college. The first person who made a direct impact as a mentor, I think, in terms of my actual academic career, actual scientific career, was my undergraduate mentor. So in Italy, you have to do a thesis during your undergraduate, at the end of your undergraduate career. And I was invited in a laboratory in the Department of Botany at the time. And because, my professor saw something interesting that we wanted to encourage, and that was the first time that I was actually given an opportunity to do research, to really have a little bit of an idea of what it would be like to be a scientist on a day-to-day basis. And then after that, I met a number of people who have been encouraging and being mentors in a positive way, as role models in science, or first and then later on in philosophy. So there's a number of people that have actually been influential all the way from my childhood and throughout my career. Even still today, I have some of my colleagues that I look up to as inspiration, even though now I'm a full professor with tenure and all that sort of stuff. But still, there are colleagues who I say, I wish I would like that guy or that person, that woman. And so I strive to improve in that direction.
Were you initially always attracted to the academy because of your science, or was that just like a good avenue for you because of your science? Did you see yourself in any other institution?
No, I didn't. That's interesting. I always saw myself as a academic and as pursuing a career as a university professor. I did have the opportunity to work for the National Research Council in Italy, which is a research but not academic institution. So there is no teaching, for instance. And I didn't like it. I mean, it was an interesting experience, but I didn't like it. I guess at some level, I've always been interested in teaching as part. A lot of academics try to do as little teaching as possible because that they think that that's distracting from their actual research. And that has never been the case for me. I mean, I've been lucky to be at institutions where the teaching was not overwhelming, because if you have to teach 3, 4, 5 courses per semester, then you really don't have time to pursue your research. I've always been academic institutions that were understanding of that and that could afford to pay their professors in order to do a little bit of teaching and then the research. But when there is a good balance between the two, that is my preference. I rather teach than not teach. Again, within certain limits, as long as it doesn't really make it impossible for me to do my research or my scholarship. So yeah, the notion from very early on was of an academic career as a university professor. And I've been lucky that I've been able to pursue this against the odds, because the chances of even getting into a doctoral program in Italy at the time were not very high, and let alone the chances of actually becoming eventually a full-time professor. And so I feel very grateful that I've been able to pursue that, and it worked out.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm glad that you were able to pursue it as well. All right. So a little bit more onto academic issues, since we were on the topic. You are a fundamental part in the development of this new evolutionary synthesis. It's called the extended evolutionary synthesis. And in this sense, how did your interest in building this new theory arise, or contributing to this new theory arise? What were the goals you were pursuing? And at what point do you think the extended evolutionary synthesis is currently within the realm of previous evolutionary theory? And do you consider it that it has already reached an epistemic maturity within biology and anthropological sciences?
Yeah, those are all very good questions. So I think that the extended synthesis, so-called extended synthesis, is getting pretty close to maturity at this point. I've been working on it before that term was actually a term, before people started referring to it as the extended synthesis. Essentially, when I was doing my PhD thesis at the University of Connecticut with my mentor, Carl Schlichting, who is the co-author of my first book. And so we're talking about the early 90s at this point. Now, there have already been people before then, of course, working on something along those lines. That were, in fact, one of the things that attracted me to work with Carl is precisely that he was aware and interested in these then very new trends in terms of sort of updating evolutionary theory, which had not been updated since the 1930s and early 40s. I mean, the previous iteration, which is sometimes called, often referred to as the modern synthesis, was basically finished, was basically complete in the 1940s. And so from the 1940s, you jump to the late 80s or early 90s, and we're talking about half a century where biology had been very successful, evolutionary biology had been very successful, but the core of the theory had not changed basically at all. And an increasing number of people started realizing that that some kind of change would have to come, because there were a number of empirical discoveries, empirical phenomena that did not fit very well with the modern synthesis, with the original version. And there were a lot of theoretical improvements and theoretical novelties that also did not fit with particularly well with the modern synthesis. So this obviously was not just my or Carl and mine suggestion. There were people that were working on it in paleontology. Certainly Stephen Jay Gould had been making noises in that direction since the 70s and the 80s. And there were several authors, again, before us. When we put together that first book that came out in the mid-90s, late 90s, that one came out of my dissertation, actually, as it turns out. My dissertation was empirically oriented. It was a series of empirical investigations of phenotypic plasticity, which is the phenomenon by which the same genotype produces different phenotypes in response to different environments. And so it was very empirically based. But there was a last chapter in the thesis that kind of expanded sort of conceptually what I was trying to do, and had a discussion, in the beginning of a discussion of the status of evolutionary theory, how phenotypic plasticity would fit into the modern synthesis, if at all, and that sort of stuff. And then at some point, Carl and I were talking about, this was after I defended my dissertation at University of Connecticut, and we were talking about it. And Carl said, it occurred to me that last chapter could be expanded significantly and basically become a book. And when he made that suggestion, I thought he was crazy, because I was at that point on a tenure track at the University of Tennessee. So I was a young assistant professor, and I've been told by everybody, don't write a book. Books are the kind of things that scientists write when they are near retirement, or in fact are already retired, but not early on in their career, and certainly not until you get tenure, because book writing takes a lot of time, gets in the way of doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is getting grants funded to get your research going and your lab going. So I looked at him and I said, I don't know about this. But we eventually decided to sit down and start writing this thing. And that was one of the best things I did, in fact, in my career, because that book was impactful later on a number of other people. It still is read today. And it is one of the very early books that consciously set out to sketch an outline of a next iteration in evolutionary theory, what eventually later on became started being referred to as the extended synthesis. So that was it turned out to be a great move. Now, several years later, I co-organized a workshop for a few days at the Konrad Lorenz Institute in Vienna, specifically aiming at getting people interested in the extended synthesis, getting them together and talk about what their field was doing in that area. And that resulted into an edited book published by MIT Press, which was really the very first coordinated statement of the extended synthesis. This came out already more than 10 years ago. Ever since, people have taken up the ball and kept running with it. So we have a lot more research that's been done. We have a lot more papers that have been published, several more books that have been published on the extended synthesis. So I think that the idea is now reaching maturity. It's still controversial. There's still a number of evolutionary biologists who think that we don't actually need an update to the modern synthesis, that the modern synthesis is doing just fine. Obviously, I think they're wrong, but that's a discussion that the community has to sort out one way or the other. To me, the indication is that the community is going in the direction of an extended synthesis, simply because I see a large number of grant proposals funded in that area. That's usually a good indicator of where a field is going. I see new faculty positions that have been taken up by people who are interested in that approach. And of course, more importantly, I see a lot of papers, not just theoretical papers, but empirically based papers in that direction. That said, often the extended synthesis is presented as a kind of a revolution or a paradigm shift within evolutionary biology, and I don't think that's the case. I think of the extended synthesis, as the name itself implies, extended, not as replacing, but as improving on the original version, just like the modern synthesis was called a synthesis for a good reason. It was not supposed to be a completely novel theory. It was supposed to be a synthesis of different strands of Darwinism as they had developed over the decades between Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species and the 1930s and 40s. So I think I see the evolution of evolutionary theory, if you will, as a kind of a more or less gradual series of expansions and rethinking of the theory itself, not as a series of revolutions, not as a series of paradigm shifts. So that may sound much less glamorous than some of my colleagues might like, for instance, but it is what it is. My understanding of the progression of the field of evolutionary biology is that it has been essentially gradual over the last 150 plus years.
Interesting. Yeah, it seems I don't see them butting heads, the modern synthesis and the evolution and the extended synthesis. It seems more like the extended synthesis is filling some of the gaps, or right. Yeah. And it's not even that they couldn't answer those questions; they just weren't talking about them, which is kind of an interesting difference between the two syntheses, because the modern synthesis, of course, was implemented because of genetics, right? And so, but this one is more of, like you said, it was just how we're thinking and talking about these tools and the data and everything.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think that I guess I'm going to disagree slightly on the notion that the modern synthesis had all the tools that were needed in the first place, and they were just not talking about certain stuff. Yeah, they were certainly not talking about certain things. For instance, famously, developmental biology got left out entirely of the modern synthesis. But I think it got left out precisely because they didn't know how to talk about it. It is really difficult to use the major framework of the modern synthesis, which is population genetics, as you pointed out. It's essentially mathematical and population genetics. It's really difficult to use that framework to say something meaningful about developmental biology, for instance, or paleontology. And those are important branches of evolutionary theory. Those are major fields. You can't just leave them out because you don't have the tools to talk about them. And so the extended synthesis is essentially trying to go beyond a framework that is based only on population genetics. That doesn't mean a rejection of population genetics. Population genetics theory is perfectly solid and empirically grounded, and it's here to stay. But it is only one portion of what's going on in evolutionary biology, and there are other issues, especially even just at a theoretical level, that cannot be treated very well by population genetics, and that's why we need to expand further the scope of what biologists actually do.
Interesting. Yeah, that's my goal as a postdoc, getting more into growth and development, because a lot of my work has been on like the adult products of evolution, like allometric changes and all that, but I'm really interested in how those changes arise now. So hopefully I'll get some good questions answered. All right. So as we talked about, you were a tenured professor in biology for some time before pursuing a PhD in philosophy. I think this is an important question for a lot of academics who don't have the opportunity to continue. What was it like navigating this career transition for you? Even though it was still within the academy, it was still a transition in a sense. And having been linked to evolutionary biology for so long, how did you start your interests in the field of philosophy? Which I think we mentioned briefly before, but
yeah, good question. I mean, I had an interest in philosophy since at least high school, and that's because in Italy, when I was growing up, I had to take 3 years of philosophy in high school, and my teacher was wonderful. She made the field really come alive, and so I developed an interest in philosophy actually fairly early on. And even when I was in college pursuing biology, I kept reading philosophy, and particularly philosophy of science. One of the people that I mentioned was influential on my very early understanding of science, Peter Medawar. Even though he was, from an empirical perspective, was a medical researcher, he wrote basically what we might consider books in philosophy of science. So there's always been an interest in the back of my mind about it, but it was not the kind of interest that I thought I would develop into an actual career until the midlife crisis happened. You know, this happens to a lot of people. A lot of academics at some point realize that they've been doing things in a certain way for 20 years or 25 years or whatever it is, and then at some point say, yeah, I don't want to do the same things for another 20 or 30. So I'm going to do something different. I'm going to change. But many people, when they get to that stage, they look at nearby fields. That is, let's say, from evolutionary biology to ecology, or from molecular biology to evolutionary biology, or something like that. In my case, I looked a little further away than just a nearby field, and that is for a couple of reasons. One, as I said, it was my interest in philosophy that dates back to high school. But the other one is that when I started writing a number of sort of conceptual theoretical papers and then a couple of books about evolutionary biology, I was already beginning to do what some people might consider philosophy of science, right? So especially, again, the last chapter of that first book with Carl Schlichting is explicitly philosophical in nature. It actually invokes a particular way of looking at progress in science that was articulated by Imre Lakatos, who was an influential philosopher of science in the 1970s. So there was already philosophy of science basically going on. And then something serendipitous happened, as it is often the case in life. I was at the University of Tennessee as a full professor with tenure, and they hired a young philosopher of science, Jonathan Kaplan, who had just defended his dissertation at Stanford. And his dissertation was on essentially philosophical aspects of the gene-environment interaction, issues. And that's what I was working on as a biologist: gene-environment interactions, phenotypic plasticity, things like that. So Jonathan was aware of my research, and he looked me up when he came to campus. He said, I've been citing your work, and it'd be nice to just go out and have a coffee and chat about things. Which we did. And then one thing led to another. We hit it off very well. Jonathan started coming to my lab meetings and interacting with my lab graduate students and postdocs. Then we started collaborating on some joint papers that we published both in biology journals and philosophy journals. And then at some point, I basically said to Jonathan, I'd like to pursue this thing more seriously. And I was thinking of going back to school and get a PhD in philosophy, with the possible notion of eventually switching entirely field. And I asked him to be my advisor. And he looked at me and he said, how many glasses of wine did you have today? Because it was crazy. I was a full professor with tenure. He was an assistant professor without tenure yet. And he said, well, I don't know. I wouldn't even know how to do this. And I said, nope, I did not drink. I don't drink for lunch. So here it is. And then, it warmed up to the idea. We went to the dean. We asked permission to do this very unusual thing. And so what happened was that for 3 years, I was running the lab during the day and then walking across campus to the philosophy department in the evening, taking courses there. And 3 years later, I defended my dissertation, and it worked. So it's been that kind of process where part of it was deliberate and part of it was sort of the result of serendipity. And in fact, I did not switch immediately career, meaning that for 5 more years, I moved to Stony Brook University for 5 more years as a biologist. But what happened at that point was that I decided, Stony Brook is on Long Island, which is near New York. And I decided that for just purely non-academic reasons, in terms of quality of life, I really wanted to move to New York City, and which I did. And then the problem was, however, yes, but now I live in New York City and I have to commute out to Long Island, and that's 2 hours by train one way. So that was not sustainable. And so I started looking for a job in the city. And I thought, well, at this point, I'm qualified for both biology and philosophy jobs. So I'm going to apply to whatever comes out first. And the first one came out was a position in philosophy of science at City University of New York. So I applied, and they, to my stunned surprise, they hired me, and that's how it happened.
So you are stoic then, in a sense. You kind of just go with the flow and.
In a sense. Well, I mean, the Stoics don't necessarily go with the flow, but they do accept things that are inevitable, right? So going to the flow is actually more, there are philosophies that certainly will suggest that that's the way to do it. Like Taoism, for instance, is particularly famous for, this notion of you go with the flow. For a Stoic, that's a little too passive, in fact. So you do make decisions in life, and the Stoics are actually believe that the ability to make decisions is the most important characteristic of human beings. That's how we build our lives, by making decisions, and that's why the notion of Stoicism is to be able to come up with the best possible decision, the best judgments that you can possibly have. However, you also have to accept that no matter what your decisions, no matter what your thinking is, sometimes things will go your way and sometimes things won't go your way. And the notion is therefore to pursue what you want to pursue, but at the same time, always have at the back of your mind the notion ready that you may not succeed. Things might not work out. And if they don't, that's okay, because there will be other things that you can do. You can find other ways. Marcus Aurelius, one of the major Stoic writers, puts it in terms of obstacles and finding new ways. He says, sometimes you get an obstacle in front of you, and instead of keep butting heads against the obstacle until you break your head, basically, you might want to find another way. You might want to find a way around that obstacle. And in fact, he says, sometimes the obstacle will show you the way, meaning that it will point into directions where you might actually have encounter less resistance for your plans, and and resume your course of action. And actually, that particular notion that Marcus Aurelius puts forth, it's actually not very different from Taoist philosophy. That is one of the notions of Taoism, that it's not like you go with the flow in a passive sense. You go with the flow in a sense that you want to build your life without opposing a lot of resistance to events, but rather taking advantage of events, taking advantage of what particular situations happen to be.
And how primarily is resistance measured? Is it based on our own opinion of happiness, or is it I don't know, just living in society?
Well, the Stoics have a very specific notion of what makes for a good human life. And again, as I was saying earlier, this derives from their understanding of human nature. So let's step back for a second. The Stoics think that there are two things that are really characteristic of human nature and that we need to take into account whenever we decide we have to make decisions about how to live our lives. One is we're capable of reason. That is, as we would say today, reason is our evolutionary weapon. We're not, fast runners. We don't fly. We don't swim. We don't have big muscles. Nothing like that. What we do is the ability to reason through our problems, right? So one of the fundamental characteristics of human nature is the ability to reason. The other one is that we are highly social. Obviously, we're not the only social animals. The Stoics were. Even the ancient Stoics were familiar with social insects and with other primates. But we are very highly social. Our societies are far more complex and more structured than anything else on planet Earth. So the Stoics looked at these two things, these two facts, the ability to reason and the high degree of sociality, and concluded that therefore a good human life is one where you use your mind, your brain to solve problems, and particularly you try to move in a direction that is as pro-social as possible. That is, you cultivate relationships, you try to make the world a better place for everybody, including of course yourself. So once you have those two things in mind, then what follows is that good decisions are measured as whatever decisions you arrive at that are reasonable, right? That they're logical, they're grounded on reason, and that improve the social fabric. So once you have those two criteria in mind, then you have really a criteria for how to measure whether you're making progress in life or not.
That's interesting. We've touched on this briefly before, but can philosophy, in particular Stoicism, be related to evolutionary biology and other sciences in general? And I think we answered, but if you have any more input on that.
Yeah, I think that philosophy in general is related to science and vice versa, in the sense that, yes, there are two distinct approaches. There are two distinct fields of study. If you read a philosophy paper, for instance, these days, it looks very different from a science paper, and vice versa. So there's certainly distinct fields, but they are contiguous fields, meaning that they inform each other. You cannot be a philosopher and ignore everything that comes out of science. If you do that, then you're doing bad philosophy. At the same time, if you are a scientist and you completely reject any insights from philosophy, particularly philosophy of science, then I think you are not doing as good a science as you might. There is this famous letter that Einstein wrote to a friend of his on this particular topic, where he said, if you, as a scientist, ignore the philosophy, you're like somebody who misses the forest for the trees. You're just focused, you're a practitioner, but you're not really a scholar, you're not really a scientist in the broader sense of the term. And that's precisely because the two fields are contiguous. Now, that said, of course, you can do a lot of scientific research without even opening a philosophy book and vice versa. But I think that good scientists, particularly good scientists and particularly good philosophers, they at least keep track a little bit of what the other is doing, especially in those areas where that may be overlap between the two. For instance, in biology, a lot of philosophers of science or philosophers of biology have made interesting contributions over the decades on a number of interesting, of crucial discussions in biology. For instance, the nature of species, the so-called species concept problem. There's a lot of philosophical literature on that. The extended synthesis and the structure of evolutionary theory, that's another area where philosophers have written some really interesting things. So there are these areas where it is actually good for a scientist, at least from time to time, to pick up a philosophy paper or book and say, okay, what are these people saying about this?
A little bit more about Stoicism, since we're on the topic. How is Stoicism relevant today in this world, during a time where death is occurring to people and the planet at a rapid scale and nothing seems to make sense?
Yeah, it's important precisely because nothing seems to make sense. So Stoicism is just like many other philosophies of life, both other Hellenistic philosophies, such as, let's say, Epicureanism or Aristotelianism, but also philosophies in the Eastern tradition, such as Buddhism or Taoism and so on. Those are all frameworks to help people make sense of their lives and to help people prioritize what they're doing in their lives. That's what a philosophy of life actually is. And now everybody has a philosophy of life, whether they recognize it or not. For one thing, because most people grow up in a particular religious tradition, and religions are a type of philosophy of life. So I tend to define a philosophy of life as having typically three components. It has a metaphysics, that's an account of how the world works. It has an ethics, that's an account of how you should behave in the world. And then it has a set of practices that help you actually live that particular philosophy, right? So let's say Christianity. Christianity has a metaphysics. The world was created by a God that is outside of time and space and et cetera, et cetera. It has an ethics, obviously, the 10 Commandments, the teachings of Jesus, and so on and so forth. And it has a set of practices, prayer, going to church, reflecting on scriptures, that sort of stuff. Similarly for Stoicism. The reason I find Stoicism more useful than, let's say, Christianity is because the practices are actually grounded into notions that we know are empirically sound. So some of the Stoic meditations, for instance, or the Stoic practices such as journaling, that's spending some time on a regular basis, writing analytically about your own experiences so that you can learn from yourself. Basically, that's it's referred to as philosophical journaling. We know that those practices work, because there is evidence from cognitive science, from psychology that they work. The Stoicism was the inspiration behind cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the most successful evidence-based type of psychotherapy that is available today. So unlike some religious practices, we actually know that these things work. Just like in Buddhism, for instance, let's say meditation does work. Certain meditative practices are actually useful for people. But more importantly, in my mind at least, Stoicism is helpful because its worldview is very much science-based. The Stoics are materialists. They think that everything is made of matter. Everything that has actually causal powers is made of stuff, basically, just like science would tell you. Stoics believe in universal causation, that is, everything happens as a result of cause and effect. That's one of the basic principles of science. And the Stoics believe that our own decision-making process, what sometimes is referred to as free will, is also the result of causation. That is, it's not magic. We make decisions that are influenced by both external events and factors, as well as internal events and factors. You can think of the human brain as a very sophisticated decision-making machine. So for all those reasons, I think that Stoicism is useful in the 21st century. Often people ask me, it's like, why should we be paying attention to something that's been written 2,000 years ago? And the answer to that is because we are not really that different from the people that lived 2,000 years ago. Yes, we live very different kind of lives in terms of technology. right? So the two of us are talking through a computer, something that if Seneca or Marcus Aurelius had been, witnessing, that would have thought of as a miracle, right? Something that is like, wow, how did you guys do that sort of thing? But modern 21st century human beings are still concerned with the same kinds of issues that were concerning people 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. We still have the same wants and desires and the same fears and the same preoccupations and so on and so forth. Let me just give you a very simple example. There is a letter that Seneca, one of the Stoic writers, wrote to his friend Lucilius, where he was complaining about the noise coming out from his apartment. He was complaining about the fact that his apartment was very noisy. There was stuff, voices coming from the street and stuff like that. And I looked out at my apartment in Brooklyn. And I said, yeah, I can sympathize. I got the same exact problem, right? But more broadly, they were also concerned with the same big issues. How do we live our life? How do we do the right thing? How do we face adversity? How do we face the fact that we are mortal and at some point both our loved ones and ourselves are going to die? Those questions didn't go away. They're still here. And so the insights that the Stoics or the Buddhists or the Taoists had 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, many of them are still with us today. Now, not all of them, which means, of course, that Stoicism, just like any other philosophy, needs to be updated for the 21st century. Some of my work has been, in fact, in that direction. But that's not surprising. Even though they were really insightful people with a really interesting understanding of human nature, even so, they were, of course, limited by their own time and culture. And so, 2,000 years later, we do things slightly different. But that is not different from the way it works for religions. Nobody is a Christian today in the same way in which people were Christians 2,000 years ago. It just doesn't work that way. You still have to update your beliefs. You have to update the way you think about things according to the times and culture. But you do that on a bedrock of good understanding that traces back many, many centuries.
It's funny, as you were talking about the noise in your apartment,
you got noise in yours. That's right.
So what type of behavioral and research ethics do you think are important for academics in today's world?
Oh, that's a complex question. There's a lot of different facets to it. I would actually argue that academics ought to take and increasingly do take courses in ethics, at least at the level of graduate education, because the ethics of research is complex, because there is lots of stuff, depending on what you work on. Animals is one that's different from plants. Human beings is even more complicated, of course, if you do research on human subjects. But an increasing number of universities are sensitive to this, and actually, like at City University in New York, we have to go, if you do research of that kind, you have to go through training, to ethical training. The unfortunate bit about that is that too often that kind of training is set up by lawyers as opposed to ethicists. And so it is done in order to, protect the university, you personally as a researcher, but more importantly, the university from lawsuits and from, things like that. And that's fine. I understand why people have to do that sort of thing. But to me, it's actually, those kind of courses should be designed by an ethicist, not by a lawyer or by a bureaucrat, because ethics is important. So, today we tend to think of ethics as the study of right and wrong, right? If you say, what is the moral thing to do? What you're asking basically is this right or is this wrong? And that's fine. But the ancient Greeks and Romans, and in fact, the ancient Indians and Chinese had a much broader view of ethics. Ethikos in Greek just meant how you behave in society. And that's the root of the word ethics. And then it was Cicero, the Roman writer, that translated that to moralis in Latin, which is where we got the word morality, right? So ethics and morality are the same thing, essentially. They're synonyms. They're one the translation of the other, really. And they both have to do with living one's life within the broader fabric of society. So sure, knowing the difference between right and wrong is important. It's obviously part of that living, but it goes well beyond that. So to study ethics, it really literally means, according to the ancients, to study how to live your life. And it seems to me that everybody should be interested in that, not just researchers, not just universities. Courses in ethics in that broad sense should be available to people, of all walks of life, regardless of what they're doing as a profession. But particularly in terms of scientific research, there are a lot of issues in terms of treatment of the subjects of research, animals or humans. There are issues in terms of the priorities that you want to give to your research. Why are you doing research on this particular topic rather than another? There are issues of funding. There's limited resources, so the funding should go. We should have priorities in terms of where we put our funding, where we put our money, and those priorities ought to be informed also by our ethics. Our way of figuring out what's important and what's not important. So definitely a complex issue, but definitely something that has to be there, and increasingly is there as part of the training of the modern scientist.
All right. Now a little bit more about you and your daily life and what you're doing with your life and how you live and etc. Could you tell us briefly about your current activities, and what does a person as important to the sciences and philosophy and evolutionary biology as yourself, what do you spend your time doing with, and what's a day-to-day life in Dr. Pigliucci?
Well, day to day, I spend a lot of time writing and reading. Really, those are my major activities, and of course, teaching mixed in between. Those three things obviously inform each other. You can't really write or teach unless you read a lot of stuff that is more or less pertinent to what you want to write about or you want to teach about. Other than that, I live in New York City, which is a wonderful place where to live if you can afford it, because it's pretty expensive. But some of my activities are the kind of things that you would expect in a multicultural, large city like New York. I like, for instance, to listen to music, particularly jazz and blues, but also some classical and opera from time to time. And New York City offers quite a bit in that area. I like to eat well, and so again, New York is a good place to be because you can sample all sorts of international cuisines. There's no such thing as American cuisine, basically, per se. I mean, it's like burgers and steaks, but there are a lot of international cuisines from all over the world. I mean, I live in Brooklyn, and which is not very far from the border of Queens, and Queens is, it's got the largest number of languages spoken in the entire United States in a few square miles, and that also means the largest number of cuisines that you can possibly sample without having to travel internationally. So that's pretty much my life. It's a lot of writing and reading and teaching, and then enjoying what New York City has to offer. I mean, as I mentioned before, it was a very conscious decision to move here. It was a question. It was really an issue of quality of life. I decided that I've gotten to the point where quality of life had to be at least as important as my career, if not more. And so it was a very conscious decision.
Yeah, I'm kind of at a similar crossroads. So I've been at University of Missouri for the past, 10 years or so. I've finished my PhD, but now I live in St. Louis, and I'm from California originally, but I do not want to just move to another small Midwestern or Southern town. And
exactly.
I actually turned down a postdoc in Texas because I couldn't do it again. I'm at that point where I need like a better quality of life. And I've been looking at New York and going back to California, but I'm happy that you have that. That's amazing.
I hear you. I sympathize. And one mistakes that a lot of academics do make is early on, especially in the career, is to essentially forget about your needs as a human being, and you just go for your career. To some extent, you're forced to do that because, as you know, it's not easy to find academic positions. So you have to be flexible. You have to be open, especially early on, to go wherever it is that there are jobs. But it has to be done up to a point, and at some point you will have to start asking yourself, yes, I want to be a scientist, I want to be an academic, but I also want to be a well-balanced human being, and so there is a lot more to life, of course, than just your work as an academic.
Yeah, it's been an interesting kind of identity shift. I'm only in my early 30s, but I feel like I'm going through an early 30s midlife crisis. But so we'll leave a few seconds, and then basically after a few seconds, there's just some space for you to talk about anything else you would like to leave with the audience today, relating to something we talked about in the interview or other topics in general.
Okay.
And whenever you're ready.
Well, we talked about all sorts of things. We're talking about philosophy, both the academic field and the personal philosophy of life. We talked about science. If there is anything to add to that, is I would say to your listeners that science is important not just as an academic pursuit or as a field of research, as a job for some people. It's important because it informs our entire understanding of how the world works. And we cannot live a good life, even the Stoics agreed, unless we actually have a good understanding of how the world works. So science is important not just as a discipline, not just as a job. It's important as a major guidance to how we should live our life.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for talking with us today. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.